Ja, nou dan kijk we niet gewoon op. Ja. Als je hem vastpakt, gaat hij weer aan. Hij weet wanneer die invlucht. Ja, ja. Die moet dus zelf nog een maatje staan. Ja, ja. Dus die twee kasten. En deze is gewoon staan. Wat moet toch nog een nieuwe? Ja, Johannes. Nieuwe? Online. Ja, succes. En jullie mogen de microfoons aan het einde gewoon beneden bij de balie inleveren. Nou, als er wat is, dan bel ons. Oké, dank je.
Laat dat nog maar heel even open. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Please. Shh. All right. It's really great to see so many of you here in this event, Pathways to Sustainability event, on the UU, me, and the Ipcc, about what the UU needs to do with the Ipcc report, the most recent Ipcc report. What does it mean to us as a university? What does it mean as a public-facing institution? And what really is in that report? That's what it's about today. We have three authors from the recent Ipcc report, one from Working Group 1, one from Working Group 2, and one from Working Group 3. We'll introduce them in due course, but first, let's take a short moment to think of what the Ipcc really is, right? Because it's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It exists sort of in between government institutions, the United Nations, and science. It was started in 1988, it was founded, to assess the best available science on climate change, to be policy informative, but not policy prescriptive. So really to say what is in climate science. In those over 30 years, it has become a fundamental institution of the way that we understand climate change, the way that we understand how we should react to climate change, and of the political debate around climate change. And I'm pretty sure we're going to see all of those three things pop up in the different contributions today. But there are a couple of things that are really important to realize about the Ipcc. One, it is an institution primarily run by scientists who volunteer their time, right? It's not an institution that is, as a governmental or scientific institution, monitoring or assessing climate change by professionals. It's people who do scientific research and then volunteer their time to do that research on top of the research that they're already doing. Secondly, that mandate of being policy informative but not policy prescriptive sort of limits what the Ipcc can say, because it is really supposed to be informative, but it shouldn't sit on the seat of the policymaker or on the seat of the politician, right? That's what they should do themselves. So, in that recent Ipcc report, the 6th major assessment report, it was brought out in 3 reports. One, on the physical science basis, was published last summer. Sybren Drijfhout will talk about that in a minute. Secondly, about the impacts, the vulnerability, and what that means for ecosystems and human societies, was brought out in February. Normally, we would have had a lot of attention to that, but due to certain geopolitical events, it may have somewhat slided under the radar. Most recently, the 3rd report on mitigation of climate change, which will be presented by Detlef van Vuren, was brought out in April. We will have short presentations on these, 10 minutes. Then we'll have a very short moment where you can ask a question if there's something you don't understand. But if it's a question about directionality or what it would mean to all of us, please save that for the general discussion at the end. And then we're moving on to the next. So it's 10-minute presentation, very short clarifying question. If you have it, feel free to also just save your questions for the next, for the end. And then we're moving on from the one to the next. So without further ado, let me welcome Sybren Drijfhout, who is a lead author on the chapter on ocean, sea level, and the cryosphere in the most recent Working Group 1 report. He works for the Royal Netherlands Meteorological Institute 1 day a week. For the Dutch-speaking people, that's KNMI. He also works as a professor here at Utrecht University and at the University of Southampton. And his main expertise is around climate dynamics and climate physics. Please welcome Sybren.
So let's see. Do we have, I need to click, or the first slide will come up myself. Okay, very good. So, is there a problem? Yeah. My charming assistant will take care of this. I hope. So, I'm gonna read you because we have 10 minutes. So this will be main points. It's the dry physical basis, but we're not going to discuss the physics behind the physical basis because then it becomes very complicated. So I will focus on the main points, and we can discuss things afterwards. Well, my name was already explained, so there we go. Let's see, because I'm the most clumsy man of the Netherlands, or I think whether I can work with this. Now comes the difficult part, a laser pointer. And I always forget to stop pointing with the laser, so when I turn myself, I'm trying to blind you. That's why people don't want me to work with this. Okay, here we see on the left panel the temperature change over the last 2,000 years or so. And what we see is a very sharp rise in temperature in the last 1.5 centuries. And due to a better working together with paleo people, it's already point 1 for this faculty, we can make stronger statements. Warming is stronger than any moment within a century, and so the curve is steeper than any other moment over the last 2,000 years. And maybe over the last 200,000 years, that's something we don't know. What we do know is also that the last 1.5 centuries is warmer than any period of that length in the last 100,000 years. So it's really quite extraordinary. Then we're working with models, and we force models with natural forcings, volcanoes, solar, and with greenhouse gases and aerosols. That's the green and the brown curve, and the black curve is again the observations. So we can simulate the observations. We can explain them with our model. Okay, I don't have to walk through. I really have to get adjusted to this. So there we go. The grey one is the observed change, and the first red bar is what is due to humans, and they quite well collapse, I would say. They're quite similar, isn't it? Certainly if you see what the error bar is, there is the black small spike. Then this is interesting to know. So this is due to greenhouse gases only. So if greenhouse gases were the only human forcer, it would already be about 0.4 degrees warmer. Okay, now I'm going too fast. So we also have aerosol cooling. A few other things, but aerosols are the most important. And this is also a somewhat unpleasant message. So if India and China clean up their air, to name an example, which also the rest of the world, but those are the most important sites where we have a lot of aerosols, then global warming only gets worse. But we still want cleaner air. So that's something that awaits us. Well, volcanoes in the sun, it goes up and down, and there is no net effect anymore. And the same goes for natural variation. Given the same amount of forcing, the atmosphere and the climate also goes up and down, like the weather does. So a little bit better. That's a natural variable. Okay, I should walk. There we are. So this is what I already said. Now we're going to more things that are unique. We have the highest CO2 concentration in 2 million years. We have the fastest rates of sea level in 3,000 years. We have the lowest sea ice in the Arctic in the last 1,000 years. And we have unprecedented and the largest glacial retreat in 2,000 years. This is all these numbers we can do because we know better the paleo record. Extreme weather. A lot of it. It's a big issue. Is it already there? Is it becoming more often? And the answer, of course, is yes, yes, and yes. So, extreme temperatures. Any heat wave, there was already recently published it. So any heat wave that we now experience is at least partly due to global warming. And what can we see? At 1.5, so we're close to 1.5 degree warming already, so we're at 1.1. It occurs 4 times more often than in the pre-industrial. And if we go to 4 degrees, it will be 9. So heat waves will become more often. But if what you see here, okay, I needed the laser. I'm going too slow also. Ah, yeah. So with 1 degree, so you see that this number is all the time a little bit larger than the number above. So the extremes will increase more than the average. So that means the PDF is becoming broader, a longer tail. You know what PDF is. So it's the distribution of them. So that is an extra worry. And then of course in the cities it will go even faster. And in Europe and over there it already goes faster than global average. So all these things have to be added up. Okay, everything of course becomes worse and more often. Droughts, we're getting more droughts, it also becomes stronger, we're getting more extreme precipitation, more often and stronger. Okay, flooding I didn't mention, and so we can attribute things to global warming. The India heat wave, the Canada heat wave 1-2 years ago, I don't remember the exact date, and the Limburg, Germany, Ardennes flooding, it's all attributed to humans. Okay, this is a little bit of story that I will go further on to this, but a little bit about temperature increase and CO2 or greenhouse gases increase. Another driver with CO2 is the most important one. So we have calculated all these scenarios and calculated their effects. And I still want to stress here that if you want to stay below, say, 2 degrees, you need these two scenarios, and this line is 0. So we can only do that if we go to negative emissions. And there is still no real good idea how to do that on a large scale in a good way. If we can't do that, then we will probably go to 3, 4, or 5 degrees. Sea level rise. Sea level rise depends, of course, on the emission scenario. And you see here the effect of all these different scenarios. It's very simple. If it heats up more, then of course the sea level will rise faster. This typical line is this will be the sea level rise if processes that we think are important, but that we are yet unable to really quantify in a decent scientific way, and so they're not accounted for in the scenarios, will really come into play. And what are those? They are associated with instabilities of the large ice sheets, Greenland and especially Antarctica. So people may have heard of something like Doomsday Glacier. Waits is already close to at least the floating ice shelf that is buttressing the glacier flow is close to a collapse, and that is one of the elements that may cause a switch from the dark red line to the dark stippled line. And you see these curves go up. So what we still should realize, and I cannot stress enough, even if tomorrow, or in 2100, but even tomorrow, if we are carbon neutral, yes, I will stop in a minute or two. If we are tomorrow carbon neutral, if tomorrow the temperature will not rise by 1 centigrade for the coming 1,000 years, then sea level will still rise with many meters in the coming 1,000 years. But sea level goes on, even if global warming stops. And that is already illustrated in the next slide, which looks a bit weird, but it is to give you a clue of what we can expect in 2300. And then the bars become much larger than what we could expect in 2100. And no, it even has a SSB 1 or 2.6 hardly increases the temperature anymore after 2100. But sea level is this one. Okay. So this one will go up to something like here. This one will go up to something like here. Between 2 and 7 meters, and if all those unknown processes come into play, it can become 15. Bye-bye to the Netherlands. And then I'm more or less ready. So what can we do in this university? Well, everybody can take his own responsibility. I hear all the time of students that are going to Thailand to eat insects there, and you should stop immediately. But this is then about science. Tipping points and low likelihood, high warming storylines. And it's also related to the ice caps, ice sheet modeling, and flood risks. It's a domain of credit to Robert on the wall. Hydrology, drought likelihood. So Kane and I can a little bit do the atmospheric drivers, but how this really works out in the soil of the Netherlands and below the cities. That's something that people do very well. And the paleo perspective. So due to the paleo perspective, we are more able to make very strong assessments of how unique we are already in this story of climate change. Climate change is always, but never so badly as it does now. And now we are going to a real impact story.
Thank you so much, Sybren. Before we turn over, is there anything that was fundamentally unclear to someone? Then, if not, let me welcome Marjolijn Haasnoot, also an Ipcc author, but on Working Group 2 on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability, a lead author on Chapter 13 on Europe, and Marjolijn is a researcher at Deltares. She works on water management, integrated assessments, decision making, and deep uncertainty. And she's an associate prof here at UU as well. Please welcome Marjolijn, and I'm very eager to hear your story.
Okay. Well, very nice to see that so many people came to listen to our talks. So my talk will be about Working Group 2, about impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. And this quote actually summarizes the findings of our report. So the science is very clear. Climate change is a threat to human well-being and the health of the planet. And any further delay of action will miss a brief and rapidly closing window to secure living on this planet. So this report sometimes is called the Doom Report, but we also offer solutions. So it's not only the bad thing, but you have to continue reading, right? So the first part is about impacts, and then we talk about solutions. Climate change, global warming has already affected nature. It has already caused widespread disruption. Here you see a picture of impact of drought on forests. It has already impacted lives of billions of people despite adaptation. So, for example, in Europe, we have already observed increase in precipitation. We have already an increase in the combined impacts of drought and heat. Climate change is already here. And all these impacts occur together with other challenges, right? It's not only about climate change, but there's also this urbanization, this habitat destruction, and all these developments come together. And then we have this extreme events that Sybren already mentioned, and these can also come together. They can come quite close after each other, and thereby they compound the risk and increase the overall risk to nature and people. And as a result of that, it becomes increasingly difficult to manage. And this is actually a bit new in this assessment compared to previous assessments, is that we typically talk about these compound and cascading impacts that also go across different regions and across different sectors. Sometimes I get these questions about why should we not focus mostly on adaptation, but also impacts outside the Netherlands, outside Europe, will also backfire to us. There is this connectivity across the world. So every degree of warming matters. Okay, this irritates me a bit. Can I move this? Yeah. Okay. Every bit of warming matters. Sybren was talking about 2 degrees, then I immediately think, no, it's 1.5 degrees. It matters a lot. Because with every bit of warming, the impacts will increase and also the risk increase. Nou, hij doet het niet zo goed. Here you see a picture of, again, the scenarios that Sybren already explained. It's a time series and then the global warming. And you see the different scenarios. And even if we are able to mitigate our emissions and have negative emissions, and we mitigate global warming, we might still go above 1.5 degrees. And even if we go above, which we call overshoot pathways, there will be impacts on people and nature, and there will be irreversible impacts also. For example, habitat loss of species, but also loss of glaciers, loss of ice, increase of sea level rise, as Sybren already. And this then, of course, also impacts people. And here there are different burning embers, which is typical for working group 2, where you see with the different colors the increase of the impacts. More red, more purple is a higher impact. And it's for different reasons of concerns, reasons why we need to mitigate climate change. And the gray line here is where we are now, and you see already for some threatened systems, we are already at large impacts. So continue, bear with me, I come to the solutions right away. So global warming results in risks, and typically increase in heat, increase in water scarcity. Already at 2 degrees, regions that depend on snow melt already experience a 20% decline of water availability. it also affects our food security. This becomes larger with larger warming. And it affects billions of people. It results in increase in flood risk, for example, from extreme rainfall, but also from sea level rise. And this is sea level rise is an existential threat for small islands, but also other low-lying regions of the world. It's a severe and distinctive challenge compared to these other hazards, as it has this slow onset, escalating impacts, and it has a long-term commitment, as Sybren already explained. And because of this long-term commitment to sea level rise, it also means a long-term commitment to adaptation. So adaptation has already happened. It has reduced impacts. It's often cost-effective, but this adaptation progress is uneven. So in some regions, adaptation has occurred, but in other regions, it has not. And it's mostly incremental, which means small changes compared to the current situation. And we are not adapting fast enough. If you think about the current rate and then think about the future risks, then we need to make bigger steps. So there are adaptation options, a range of options, and in this report we looked in particular at the effectiveness and feasibility of all these options. So what is their effectiveness to reduce these risks and the feasibility to really implement these measures? And nature offers significant untapped potential, also because it has wider benefits than only adaptation to climate change. For example, it has benefits for livelihoods and, of course, also for nature. Many of these adaptation options are related to water and to land, to the availability of water and land. And as a result of that, there may also be competition, not only between adaptation options, but also with options for mitigation. Competition, but possibly also synergy. So this is something that we need to think about also within the Ipcc, maybe in the future, to integrate these two working groups. So for example, for flood risk, early warning systems and flood protection have been effective and are effective also in the future. But with protection, there comes also residual risk. We cannot avoid all risk, and there is this potential for a lock-in situation where it becomes more difficult to adapt in the future. Room for the river, in particular in regions like Europe, has much more potential to reduce riverine flood risk. And an option that is not so much considered but can also reduce risk is avoidance. So not building in risky places or relocate from risky places. And for early warning, again, also early warning systems, for water scarcity, also early warning systems are an option. Also the reuse of water, water storage, irrigation can be effective, but can also have adverse outcomes, for example, on groundwater or also in other regions. And actually in both flood risks and water scarcity, changes in land use is also an adaptation options. But the effectiveness of most of these options declines with increased warming. Cities are hotspots for adaptation. A lot of people live there. There's a lot of development. So they are hotspots for adaptation, but also for mitigation. So adaptation can also go wrong and can have unintended adverse consequences, such as an increase in risk, maybe in a different region, for different people, in an increase in emissions and a potential lock-in situation. But this can be avoided through integrated, multi-sectoral and inclusive planning, for example, with flexible pathways that account for this long-term adaptation commitment, for example, like this sea level rise. And unfortunately, despite that there are many adaptation options, there are also limits to adaptation, and that is why it's very important to also mitigate climate change, as this makes it more possible to adapt. We will have more time to adapt, and we will reach less limits. So even if we have effective adaptation, we cannot prevent all losses and damages because of these limits of adaptation. Above 1.5 degrees, some of these options do not work anymore, in particular natural solutions. Above 1.5 degrees, in particular with water scarcity, if you cannot store or save water if there is no rain, right? So there are limits also to adaptation to water scarcity. Nature-based solutions, they require space and sediment. And a flood infrastructure like flood protection cannot prevent water from going to the ground. But there are also wider benefits for adaptation, so it's really valuable to do. So despite this progress and despite that we do have all these options to adapt, there are increasing gaps between the adaptation actions that is taken and what is needed. And this is expected to grow with increasing warming. And for that, we need this long-term planning and accelerate also the implementation, not only have plans, but also really act on that. And particularly in the next decades, it's important to close these adaptation gaps. And for that, we have also this concept of climate resilient development, where we link adaptation, mitigation, and development, and explore alternative pathways. And so in this figure, you see, for example, that some decisions are not possible anymore. We have already missed opportunities, but we still have possibilities to adapt in time if we act and if we mitigate climate change and use the time wisely for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Marjolijn. Very clear, I think. Are there any questions for clarification from the room? No? Then we'll turn to Detlef van Vuren, lead author of the third working group report on mitigation. Detlef is a professor here in integrated assessment modeling. He also works for PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. He's been working on mitigation for a very long time. He's one of my favorite people to disagree with, but I also learn a lot from him, so I hope you learn a lot from him as well. Please welcome Detlef.
Thank you.
I was trying to do something with the live stream.
Okay, so we now move to the brightest of the working groups, which is working group 3, which is mostly about solutions. But let's start with some bad news, which is the historical emission trend. And this is the trend in the last 30 years. And as you can easily see, the emissions have been increasing. In 1990, more or less, the first Ipcc report came out. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement. But since, despite all those reports, all those actions, emissions have been increasing. They mostly come from CO2 from fossil sources, as seen in blue. CO2 from land use is in yellow, is another important source. Then we see methane as an important source of emissions. And then some smaller sources are the nitrous oxide and the F-gases. Now we can use models to make projections of how this would continue to develop. And maybe some first good news is that if we now look into the assessment of current policies, if we look into the fact that renewables have become competitive with fossil fuels, this is the projected emission trajectory under current policies, the best estimate that we can make, which shows that emissions would continue to grow, bad news, but not as fast as they did historically, and also not as fast as some of the most pessimistic projections that we have made in the past. You see here greenhouse gases on the left, you see CO2 emissions in the middle. The graph that I put now next to it is actually a graph that was published in AR5 by Ipcc. It wasn't in the SPM of Working Group 1 this time, which is unfortunate because I think it is one of the nicest graphs that the Working Group 1 ever made, which shows you the cumulative CO2 emissions on the one axis and the temperature on the other axis. And because CO2 is so long-lived, what you actually see is a linear relationship. And so if you put CO2 in the atmosphere, it will continue to lead to warming. And you can use this relationship directly to estimate climate change. So if we calculate the consequence of the CO2 emissions in the middle, so staying around 40 gigatons of CO2 for 80 years, 3,200 gigatons of CO2 more, add them to the 2,400 gigatons that we already emitted, and you can calculate easily that the temperature is expected to increase by about 2.2 to 3.5 degrees. Now, if you remember the Marjolijn's reasons for concerns, the burning embers, and with this type of temperature increase, you're way into the red and purple zones. And so we are in high-risk temperatures. So this is not what we want. And clearly, in the Paris Agreement, we have said that we didn't want to do this. And so we promised to ourselves that we want to stay well below 2 degrees and preferably 1.5 degrees. We can use the same graph to then calculate how much CO2 can we still emit. There's actually the uncertainty is indicated in this graph as well. And so the most sensitive models are on the high end, the least sensitive models are on the low end. And so you have to make a decision a little bit on which models do you believe. But if you read it somewhere, then you can calculate that with a reasonable chance of staying below 1.5, you can still emit 4 to 500 gigatons of CO2. For 2 degrees, about 1,000 gigatons of CO2. From the graph in the middle, you can see that we now emit about 40 gigatons of CO2. And so for 1.5 degrees, 10 years of current emissions, and you have passed the 1.5 degree target. But we can now use the same models to calculate pathways that are consistent with these goals. And we can do that with the Working Group 3 models, and you get pathways like this. And so in cyan, you see the 1.5 degree pathways. In purple, you see the ones that are consistent with staying well below 2. And as already indicated by Sybren, and most of these go negative. It's not absolutely necessary. The more you are able to reduce the emissions very fast in the short term, you're able to avoid some of that overshoot and the need for negative emissions. And so reducing emissions fast gives you options. It gives you the option to stay at lower temperatures. It also avoids the need for negative emissions. But you can also see from this is that from 1.5 degrees, emissions need to peak before 2025. And already around 2030, emissions need to be reduced globally by about 40 to 45%. And they reach net zero around 2050. That's 30 years from now. And most of the buildings, the infrastructure we build is designed to stay there for at least 40 years. And so that means more or less building now everything carbon-free, and certainly in the West. For 2 degrees, 2070 reaching net zero, but this is only true if you start reducing emissions relatively fast now. Because if you don't, you start to eat up this carbon budget really, really fast, and then your emission year actually comes earlier. So current policies are clearly inefficient. I was pointing out these current policies in orange. One thing I did not point out yet was this here. This is the NDCs. That's the promises from countries to reach. So we have 2 gaps. First of all, current policies are not reaching the NDCs. So current policies are not, countries are not implementing what they promised. And what they promised is not enough to reach the overall goals of the Paris Agreement. So those 2 gaps still need to be overcome. But targets can be reached. The models actually look into real technologies. They do economic calculations, but it requires actions in all sectors and deep reductions of fossil fuels, and especially coal. And especially for 1.5 degree, it's about 1 minute to midnight. We really have to start acting now, this decade. So what we do in the report is showing different pathways that are consistent with 1.5 degrees and well below 2, and to provide options. And so here we have the 2019 emissions again, and the different sources of emissions. And then we looked into 5 possible strategies, just to illustrate that there are multiple strategies. And One is looking into gradual strengthening. One is looking into the options of negative emissions. One is specifically looking into the benefits of low renewable cost. The fourth one is looking into demand reduction specifically, and one is more also specifically looking in the alignment of sustainable development. All of them also need some of those other options. It's not that you cannot do in one area nothing, because the emissions need to be reduced so deeply, but it's a question of emphasis. Now, I can show the results of this, and then something I would like to point out is this scenario that relies on negative emissions. And many of the scenarios in the literature look something like that. And so you have emissions from hard-to-abate sectors like flying, so those would remain positive by 2050. And so if you want to compensate that, you need negative emissions to go to net zero. This can be done by afforestation. That can also be done by bioenergy at CCS, or there are also the direct air capture options. And so there is this ability, the possibility of going negative and compensating some of the positive emissions. But I would like also to point out that non-CO2 part, that non-CO2 part that is there is mostly coming from meat production, methane emissions from meat production. And simply with the projected population growth and the projected income growth, with the technologies that we have, and this is really being optimistic, we can more or less stabilize the methane emissions. So if you want to avoid that, you have to move to that next scenario, that low demand scenario, where we assumed all kinds of lifestyle changes, including with meat going back to healthy diets, not even to vegetarian diets, just eating less meat, which has a substantial impact on reducing some of those remaining hard-to-abate emissions, and therefore there's much less need for those negative emissions. So the next part of the report looked into all kinds of options. And so there were the chapters that looked into industry, transport, into buildings, and they summarized all kinds of emission reduction options per sector. You can't read them, but I have summarized it a little bit in a different graph, which could show, yeah. So I've simply added up all kinds of different categories, and then wanted to point out that if you look at from that perspective, then there are many of these options are related to renewables, which in 2030 seems to be one of the most important emission reduction sources. The other one is, for instance, afforestation. That's an important option. Efficiency improvement in different sectors is, according to Ipcc, a very important abatement option. But then the next one, which is there for the first time, or after non-CO2, sorry, is lifestyle. And that's the first time actually that Ipcc wrote a complete chapter on lifestyle change and the options that are available there. If you add these options together, you easily get into this 43% emission reduction. And so this is, I think, even giving you into 70%. So there is emission reduction options in principle available below $100 per ton of CO2 that provides you the pathway to 1.5 degree. So the next important message is related to the fact that in principle this means system transitions. And so we need to change the way that we're producing materials in industry. We need to change our food systems. We have to change our energy systems, our cities and buildings, transport, and related to this, we also need to think of how the way that we consume things. So that is actually that new innovation into the report. But this is not only about technology or behavior. If you want to make those changes, you simply have to change the underlying factors, underlying conditions. So you have to start thinking about the norms and societal support, about the law, about the infrastructure, the people, for instance, that are needed to get these changes done, the engineers, or the financial system. And so if you want to accelerate the transition, you have to change these conditions. So 2 slides left. First of all, the summary. The good news is there are still pathways out there that leads to 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, but we are running out of time, especially for 1.5 degrees. This decade is crucial. For 1.5 degrees, if we just stay at the current emission level, by the end of the century, we have passed 1.5 degrees. So there's a need for immediate and deep emission reductions. And the options to get us on track are available and affordable, but they need to be supported by adequate policies to implement them. So then finally, what does it mean for IPCC, for the Utrecht University? So I think the different research departments in different parts of the university, I think, can nicely speak to some of these challenges. And so we can look into assessments of system transitions and see what technologies are available, how we can create the governance and institutions, innovations to get to this. The legal consequences of some of these pathways, or to the financing. And the key question should be how really to accelerate the transition. What we can also nicely do, I think, at the Utrecht University is look into the assessment of consequences of different strategies. What does it mean for climate, but also for environment? Some of these options require land. Some of the other options might have benefits for air pollution, for instance. And to make that very clear, and also to look into the societal consequences. And that's, I think, a very important challenge also for our university. And that's where I would like to end.
Thank you so much, Detlef. Are there any questions for clarifications for Detlef? Yes, if you have a question, I have a throwing mic here. In the meantime, I would like to invite Sybren and Marjolijn also to come up, because we'll have 40 minutes for discussion, but first we'll have your clarifying question.
Two positions in the middle.
Hello, hi. I wanted to just ask you to repeat, just for clarification, the option of going at 40% emission reduction by 2050. Which degree of like how many degrees increase would it be?
So for 1.5 degrees, we need to be at 0 in 2050, and in order to achieve that, we need to be at around 40 to 45% emission reduction already by 2030. So that's in about 10 years from now. The well below 2 was 2070 for 0.
Okay, I'll allow one more question. It's not a clarification. Then we'll come back to you in a second. You have a question? Yeah. So we need to use the mic also for the live stream, because otherwise you won't be audible on the live stream.
In the graph on the cumulative carbon budget, Detlef, you said you looked at the annual emissions currently at 40 gigatons of carbon. Didn't you mean the left graph? Because the left graph showed all CO2 equivalent emissions, so I think that would have a major impact on the, because then we would talk about, like, say, 15 years, right, of current emissions.
Yeah, so in the calculations on the graph on the right, the carbon budget, we also account for non-CO2. So that temperature axis is not only influenced by the CO2, but also by the non-CO2. But because CO2 is the most dominant gas, and we still, if we plot the cumulative CO2 emissions against the temperature, we see a linear relationship. I could compare in this graph simply the CO2 emissions to the cumulative CO2, but I would have to assume, and that's what I'm doing, that if you're reducing CO2 emissions, you also take a similar action on the non-CO2 gases.
Okay, so we're talking 25 years then, yes. Okay, thank you.
Right, so thank you.
Van de livestream is of jullie ietsje op kunnen schuiven, jullie zitten buiten beeld.
Okay, so the live stream wants us to squeeze in for some reason.
I think so.
Deze geel-zwarte lijn.
Yes, probably it is. Yes.
So thank you, like the three of you, for these wonderful presentations of what is in the IPCC report, right? But as Detlef knows, one of my key interests is also how do we determine what is in the IPCC report and what is this process? And I think it's an awe-inspiring feat of collaboration, and it's a 5 to 7 year assessment cycle that you're going through. But I would like you to invite also to speak somewhat maybe critically about what is the process of how you determine what is in the IPCC. And are there things that you wish the IPCC could say that aren't in the report?
Okay. So first of all, so the contents of the report are first of all determined by the governments. So they make they determine a list of things that we need to speak to. But that list is quite broad. So as authors, we have a lot of freedom then. When we started to draft the Ipcc, all the drafts are sent to, first of all, experts, and secondly, to the governments. And so, in principle, you could enlist yourself as a reviewer. You can comment and indicate that, for instance, important topics are missing. So in principle, the system is relatively open. Also, the way that we deal with the comments, that is open as well. We have to publish on all responses the comments. The comments are enormous. Only in my chapter, we have like 4,000 comments. And so I'm...
My chapter.
But so you actually said personally you're answering at least 200 of these government comments. They are clearly related also to positions of governments. And
I can a little bit closer to your...
Yeah. If I can add to that, I think what's also nice about the Ipcc assessment is the way the authors that contribute to that. So it's a very diverse set of authors of different countries, also looking at gender, looking at age. For me, it was also very interesting to work with. Very nice people, very smart, but also with a lot of different background. And because of that, you get different input to the report from different regions, but also from different disciplines.
Yeah, I can maybe add a few things. So, although the governments decide, there is another step in between, and I was there too, and it's called the framing of the whole. So how are we going to organize the report? So if you're a careful reader, the report is more holistic and less based on, at least my report. So the first report. So it's more integrated and holistic than it ever used to be. So it used to be modeling, observations, etc., the future, the past, very divided into silos, and that has changed. And that change is decided by a whole group of authors that is volunteering in doing that framing discussion together with the leaders of your report. Then, in the end, so you volunteer and then you are ending up in a sort of chapter. And then with this framing commitment or mission in hand, you have to do your job with the people that run this chapter, your specific chapter. So that is, again, there is a little bit of freedom, I would say, again, in how to do that. Then again, the most important thing is that any Ipcc report is framed or is contextualized also by the things before. So basically, all the time you have to think, what did they say on this specific topic 5 or 6 years ago? Is there reason to make a different statement? Is there reason to say, okay, the worry is larger? Is there reason to say we are more uncertain about, for instance, whether the Gulf Stream will collapse or not than the last time? And then, that's something we said. And then you have to very detail, why are we thinking now differently than 5 or 6 years before? So that is a way of thinking, a format by which you have to support all your statements. In the end, we make a summary with bold statements and we have to make a traceability table. So if we make that statement, then the support of that statement is on page 943, line 26 to 32, or something like that. So that's a little bit how you have to work.
Yes. Maybe try to say one thing on your last question of things that might need to be changed. So there are lots of. So you already started to explain that Ipcc is policy relevant, not policy prescriptive. And so there are several rules that we need to obey to as authors. So first of all, it needs to all be in the scientific literature. Otherwise, we can't use it. It should be referenceable. And it has a cutoff date. So everything that is published after that cutoff date cannot be included. And so, for instance, now with the synthesis report that we still have to write, we cannot look into the latest policies. But so there are limitations that are in there, but they are limitations for some reasons. The second is we cannot be policy prescriptive, and that is sometimes obviously frustrating, because at some point you want to be really, really clear that this is some pathway that we need to take, otherwise. So I still at the same time think it is really, really important that Ipcc is as objective as possible, so that it is relevant for all governments and can be used in the negotiations, and that even Saudi Arabia or other countries can see this as an point of evidence that also they can accept. And they have to approve the report, and they do that in the end.
Yeah, you can hold on to that. I have my own. I still have many questions on where you feel hemmed in, but I'll leave that for a second because I know you have a question. So please take the mic and raise your hand. Make sure that Femke sees you so that she can bring the mic to you later.
Hello. So I think there is a growing sentiment amongst my peers, who are into sustainability, that the Ipcc report is not very hopeful. It's quite alarmist, and we feel like it hasn't really changed much. So I feel like maybe this might be different if there were more people from marginalized countries or youth working on this report, because I feel like it's also the fact that your generation has kind of put us in this mess. And I mean, and we see words like decolonization appearing in the Ipcc report this year for the first time, and I think that's a little late maybe for the Ipcc to write about that. So maybe this might be a harsh question, but I don't know. Why is it that there are hardly any youth or people from other countries working on the Ipcc report?
So I understood you have several questions, right? So one is then like, why haven't you said this earlier? And the other one is you feel like there's not that much representation of different countries, or so I think the Ipcc has said this earlier, but the message has become stronger about humans are causing climate change, and these are the impacts, and there's also more evidence on this, right? So this is why it has changed, and there are, if you look at all the chapters, then there is quite a diverse set of authors. It could become more. They have also let researchers in that looked at representation of different countries, different disciplines, also young and more like experienced people, to put it like that. And there's different roles also in the report where they in particular look at representations of younger people and different countries, and they also invite people, and there's I think also a little bit of budget to do so. So for example, one of the roles is also like a chapter scientist, where more younger people, younger researchers help the lead authors to do the assessment. So yeah, I think for me, if I compare it to where I work, it's quite a diverse set. No, this is not recorded, right?
Maybe yes. So I want to support it. So it is. I think it's almost unfair to suggest that it's an old white man's, conspiracy also, the Ipcc. That's definitely not the case, and it's something we talked about for hours and days, at least in my group. We have special groups with social scientists to support us, to be more inclusive, to deal with young people that are more and more invited than the older one, as you like, also with people from let's say Asia and Africa, and less from the US and Western Europe. And I think that really goes quite well in the right direction. we here in the Netherlands, so again you have to deal with white people, but in principle, if you would go internationally, it would be much more diverse. On the other hand, and that's something you have to realize, and that's also a little bit a difficult thing, so especially in working group 1, we have to deal with a lot with modeling and running global models, and that is something that is very expensive science. So even if we stand here, we turn ourselves and we stand on our head, it is for some time, also will be the case, that richer countries devote more money and more people to do this kind of science than countries that are very, very poor. And that is, of course, logical because they have other problems to solve. But that will create, even if you want to be as inclusive as possible, a little bias in the direction all the time.
I see an awful lot of hands. This is good, but it also presents us with a problem. So that if there is a question that is asked, and your question really ties into that really neatly, please raise your hand while that question is being asked. And I think, well, we already distributed the mic there, but I'll keep you in mind.
Okay, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting and clear. I had one question, which is mostly aimed at Detlef, about the pathways, the reduction pathways, which rely quite heavily on negative emission scenarios. And I have to say, I always get a bit uneasy when I see those, knowing that apart from afforestation, a lot of the technologies that are required to achieve those negative emissions are very much still in pilot stages. And hence, like, we don't actually know whether we'll be able to operationalize them on that scale. So what I wanted to ask you is if you could kind of reflect a bit on that, and also kind of the discussions and you've had within the team about, like, to the extent to which it is you can actually already model and count on those type of emission reductions.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And so as you could see that for the 1.5 degrees scenarios, they more or less rely almost all on some form of negative emissions. At least the ones that don't go as deep might rely mostly on afforestation, but otherwise they have to rely on a combination of bioenergy, CCS, or direct air capture, or anything else. For the well below 2, there are also clearly some that stay positive. The theme of whether we need negative emissions has been much more in the literature than ever before, and so you see publications of people trying to look into the question, can we avoid negative emissions and what is needed for that? And that discussion is now also to some degree reflected in the report. And even for 1.5 degrees, we show some pathways that rely almost not on negative emissions beyond afforestation. Yeah, and there is also quite a substantial part now in the report on trying to discuss the technology readiness of some of these options. I think for 1.5, we didn't say it as clearly, but for 1.5, there's no pathway to get there without some form of negative emissions. I can think we can conclude from what we see there. But for 2 degrees, there is more options. And yeah, for me, it means a few things. So first of all, it's clear that there are sustainability and feasibility concerns with some of these options. So avoiding them is attractive, which means reducing emissions as fast as we can, and also look into all kinds of other options. Secondly, they're probably needed. And so trying to look into how we can make some of these options feasible is now also no regret. And so we need some research programs to start looking into how to make these feasible and acceptable.
So just again a very practical question. That when you've asked your question, can you immediately throw the mic back to Femke? Go ahead.
Yes, wow, this is interesting. Thank you very, very much for your presentation, and it's amazing to see that there's so much going on behind the scenes in UU. My question is also related to that, since the title of this talk is UU, Me and Ipcc. I was wondering, can you see the UU responding to all the research that you're doing and the severeness of the topic that you are addressing? And therefore also, do you think UU could be one of the major institutions that shows exemplary behavior and how it can be if we really take action?
That's a really great question, but I'm going to add, what is exemplary behavior from a university then?
Yeah, and for example, also is there included that we, for example, take money from Shell directly into our research?
Excellent.
Taking money from Shell, maybe you do. No, I don't. But, okay.
Okay. Yeah, I forgot to present my last slide, which was about what Utrecht could do regarding the Working Group 2 report. And if I remember well what's on it, it's in particular, I can't read it but I remember. So, I think 4 things. Yeah, so one is understanding the system response, so more about these impacts and about compound and cascading impacts, about tipping points, as you already mentioned. And the second point is about understanding the solution space, so what are the adaptation options, what are their effectiveness and feasibility, in particular also hybrid options, so combination of engineering and nature-based solutions, so working together also with other universities. Also the long-term adaptation options and pathways for that. And then I come to the third point, is about climate resilient development pathways, so linking adaptation and mitigation, because as Detlef also mentioned, there is this transition needed from a mitigation perspective, but also for adaptation. In the longer term, we need this system transition. And then the fourth point is actually more like policy relevant research also and science, so that we can accelerate this action. So maybe not a direct answer to your question, but this is at least, I think, what the university could do, and so also accelerate this science. That's for me an important point.
Yeah, so I think both myself and also Sybren had, like Marjolijn, on the slides, the type of research that we need to do. And I think that is obviously one way as a university that we can contribute here. The research will make a difference if we are able to answer some questions that are on these slides. And the second role is, and that I think you were alluding to that, is we are also a source of emissions, of course, and we have a responsibility as well. And yeah, I think it might be, and there are initiatives already going on. I think at the university, there is a little issue that I'm working part-time at university at PBL. I think it's also for the other speakers. So, but for instance, taking simply a role similar as the emission reductions that need to be achieved globally, but then doing it a little bit faster. If it needs to be 45% globally by 2030, anyway, you would expect Western world to be faster. So maybe you could derive from that a responsibility that you would like to achieve as university. And then, obviously, there are probably within the university different views on what is easy to reduce and what is more difficult. We could have clearly some discussions about what we feel could be done easily and what may be more difficult, but maybe can at least be reduced.
Yeah, feel free to.
Well, thank you for your, it's me over here. Thank you for your presentations and also for allowing us the opportunity to have this discussion with you today. But just going back to a question we had a little bit earlier, just kind of building off of that, I wanted to ask that, you spoke about the largest emitters in the world, one of them being India, and
my colleague there spoke about inclusivity in the IPCC. And I think just going off of that, I wanted to ask that a lot of the times the onus to reduce emissions is put on developing countries, emerging powers. But is there anything being included or discussed in the upcoming IPCC reports to perhaps shift the onus back to mitigating the spillover effects from highly developed nations, which are creating climate poverty in developing nations today? So is there anything that's being done by the IPCC to kind of mitigate that effect?
So clearly also within Working Group 3 there are chapters that deal with equity, because in our working group the question is really how to divide the burden to start reducing emissions and who has to go first. And so there's a whole chapter trying to deal with equity issues in that context. Certainly also in Working Group 2, so maybe Marjolijn, you would like to add, it is an important theme. It's not like on every single page, because we have technologies assessments and things like that, but it's not something that is not addressed.
In Working Group 2 we had a special group also looking at equity across the different chapters. We, for example, also looked at different adaptation options. So is it available and for who? In the effectiveness of these options in this assessment, it was also the equity was considered effectiveness for who. Again, like an option can reduce impact in one location, but then have a negative impact in another location. So all these kind of things were considered. And I remember, at least from all the discussions also among the authors and with the government, this topic comes back several times. But it's clear that even though the emissions in the past have been different, the urgency to reduce the emissions is so large also because the impacts are in particular in the most vulnerable are the most impacted also earlier. So for them it's also very important to start soon.
No, Working Group 1. No, we just talk about the physics, isn't it? So all the things you are now alluding to, of course, do not play any role. Basically, and I agree with you, we don't have the luxury to make acceptations and to say, okay, you or this in this country that has a difficult history or whatever, doesn't have to do anything. I mean, we're 1 inch from the cliff, from whatever, and everybody has to do his and her best. And I think most of us fully agree with you that that the West and the rich countries have an extra obligation. And here again also comes a little bit, the policy element. So we can't make too strong statements that are policy prescriptive. That is not the mandate of the IPCC. We do already what we can. There is a big gray zone, and we probably go already a little bit beyond the borderlines a little bit, but we can't go too far. Also because then there will be no, so it will not be agreed anymore. It will not be something of the United Nations. And it's every round again, there are many countries that are against the conclusions and that try to frustrate the process as much as possible. And we have to deal with that. And it's sometimes also the countries that are not from the West that are really playing this frustrating role. That's all I have to say, I think.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add to that is that there was also this discussion on finance, right? So if you can help some of these countries to mitigate and adapt, that I think is an important point also.
Excellent. We have a question in the back.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. This meeting is called IPCC, Me and You. We heard about the IPCC, and we, as I see, there is a real urge to have a system change, and the university is requested also to take its role also by research. But I'm asking, is that the only thing that we can do? We could also really change ourselves, our own institutions, and really straightforward things would be, and everyone who knows me knows what I'm going to say. Maybe I shouldn't even say it, but why not move to a fully plant-based university to show that it is possible to have a system change, to take a leading role, to make this a no-fly university, with some exceptions, to divest from fossil fuels, to disconnect from Shell, and to really also do that as an institution, but also individually. If we want a system change, you can research it, but also make it happen. And it's up to us to do it. And I think that especially the Copernicus Institute, if we take this seriously, we should not only do research, we should listen to the IPCC, as we do now, and not go home and just eat meat, go on holiday by airplane, and take this seriously. We just heard it. It's now time. There is no time left. So please, please.
I'm not entirely sure if there's anything you want to respond to, because I'm guessing everyone here at least sort of agrees, and probably agrees fundamentally with these kinds of questions. I do want to get back to this sort of political space in a second, but I see a lot more hands, so we're going to take a couple questions more first.
Okay, my question is like maybe then responding to there, because like if we would change, we're like still a smaller group of people, I'd say, and it's about the large groups. It's about the larger society, which in the end will create an impact. As long as I have, for example, cheap meat I can buy in the store, there will be a lot of people which don't have either the capacity to actually like read an IPCC report or so, which will then like still continue to like make, let's say, the wrong choices if we go that way. Like, how would you like scale it up to the whole society? Like, what exactly are like your advisories for the whole society? Like, for example, to like then change, like, for example, the consumption patterns. Like,
I think it's a critical question, and so it is clear that we can reach a certain group of society relatively easy with both the report itself, but also the type of actions that are acceptable for part of the society. But if we want to reach all these emission reductions, clearly we have to somehow also reach out to society as a whole. And I think it means a few things. First of all, of course, setting bold steps and encouraging our governments to make those bold steps, to make our own choices, first of all, clearly and consistent with that, but also to make sure that somehow this transition is also attractive for different parts of society. And if you're thinking of renovation, for instance, to make sure that we go to net zero housing, maybe combine it with making that house also more attractive to live in. So somehow make sure that we formulate this transition in a way that also speaks to other parts of society that are not originally as directly spoken to by just the message of climate change only. It's a big challenge. So somehow we need to communicate this is a very large issue, and please join us, but also try to make it in a way that it's also easier for others to join in. And yeah.
So before we take the next question, can you raise your hand if you now have a question? Because I saw many, and yeah, I'm sorry, there's just no way for this. I just can't do this. But we have one here. We're going to take two at a time. So if yours connects well to this one, raise your hand. To this one coming up. You're not sure yet.
So I want to ask, because recent years, all relevant fields are actually overwhelmed with increasing studies. And because you want to write this report, you need to decide which studies you need to cite, and many of them they differ, especially in terms of number. The estimates. How do you decide which numbers you use in the Ipcc? Because that's very important for policies. And also some are actually opposite to each other. And in terms of this kind of research, how do you decide? You decide to use the latest one, or which is the most objective or the most important to use? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we're taking one behind you. Yeah.
Combined with this is, as researchers, we have a bias, a personal bias. How do you make sure that even though we publish our research, we are very biased towards not publishing null results? How does the Ipcc balance this in the report, and how can you make sure that you equate for the positives, the negative, the different numbers, but also those research that is not actually published because it's not interesting to publish?
Yes. So there are a few things that when you start joining as an author, where people start to discuss among each other what is the job that we are to do. And so first of all, an assessment is not the same as a review. And so somehow we also need to make an assessment of not only describing what's out there, but also what is relevant and what's most likely. And first of all, we need to take the full range and then start to make an assessment among the authors of whether something is more likely, maybe a smaller range than the full literature, what is more likely. So exactly the questions that you were asking, that is what the team needs to do. And ideally it means that you write a certain section with multiple authors so that you're forced to discuss. As I said, the whole thing also goes out to review, and there if you do get some review comments back. But it is somehow the art of the Ipcc work to do exactly where do you set the boundary of what you include in the work. Where do you the same for your question about overwhelming amount of literature. I think that is one problem. That's maybe the one that is more easier than the one where we don't have literature on certain topics. And so earlier there was relatively little literature on trying to avoid CDR negative emissions. Now there is some literature, so at least we could assess it. But you saw in AR5 not really anything on that. So it's not only about too much, it's also about too little.
I think what we also have done is, for example, with the assessment of adaptation options, and then you do that together. You ask also contributing authors, and they also assess a lot of literature. So it's like, I've got the number of citations, so it's a huge amount. And then for each thing that you say, you ideally have several papers in order to say something about it. And then you also look at, there's like a confidence language. So you see after a lot of sentences, you see something like high confidence or low evidence, so that already indicates whether the authors have confidence in the statements, whether there were a lot of publications saying the same thing, or whether there was, in some cases, we also mentioned that there's a low agreement or a high agreement, like a lot of papers say the same thing. So there is information on that, and this is a way, how we deal with that also.
Yeah, I agree, but we should also be honest. So it is a problem that you address. So the amount of literature is exploding. Yeah? So we had to review, or ideally, if you make a census of all the publications around the topic, then it's 10 times more than in the last report, and it was 10. So in the end, it will become an almost an unsolvable problem, almost. And of course, there will be a bias. So it's impossible to say there won't be a bias. And the bias is already that we will read more quickly and more often. Journals, the so-called high-impact journals with the highest citations, of course, have a certain preference. And that may also include a bias again to the richer and Western countries. But we do what we can. We know that it is a problem that is discussed. So we also, so we introduce every time more young people, more females, more people from countries outside the West that can prevent this bias. But it is difficult, and it will always be there to some extent, I would say. Then about water reading, we are after certain statements or numbers, so we don't have to read everything. We know what we are looking for. So is the sea level rise, is it faster, and by how much? And there is a lot of literature about sea level or whatever, but not really addressing the key point you want to make. So that is the difference between an assessment and a review. So we are, so we're not only reading, we are hunting. We are looking for specific animals in the big wood or forest of all those literature, and certain, certain statements to make. And that's a little bit also a guidance.
All right,
I think I probably have the final question.
Yes,
thank you for you guys' information this afternoon. So what I take away from all you guys' talk, like the climate is changing, we have to adapt really fast, we have to make changes, otherwise you'll get a really bleak future, because doomsday is luring. But I haven't heard from you guys what would be like your ideal optimistic scenario for what should be done from like regular people in order to like combat this changing climate in a sense.
Yeah, I can say something. So what you say is very difficult, because we all agree here in this room, and many scientists agree, but we still have not converted, if you like, the majority of our societies, and because it goes against the interest of people that live now and that are in power, and maybe it's in the interest of the young or the people that will be born later, and it's, well, it appears to be difficult for people to act or go against what they think is their own interest. And how to do that is a very difficult problem. But we do what we can. What was it? When the tax on petrol, for instance, was lowered because the petrol prices were rising, we, or at least a group of Ipcc authors, wrote a letter to the ministry, and we're going into discussion with them. Is this the right thing to do? But you have to remember, and that's basically, we can say what you have to do if you want to solve this climate problem at all costs, and that's the number one problem on the list. And maybe we think that is the case, but within a whole society there is poverty, there are other things going on. So politicians may have a different view here. And we cannot decide the priority of this problem over other problems for the nation or for the politics. That's not our role, and that's not what we should do. Then we become personal. We only can say, and should continue to say, if you want to solve this problem, you have to do that. And if you are doing this, what you're doing now, you're not going to solve this problem. And that is what we try to keep saying. But that's
so the problem is
the boundary a little bit between being not really prescriptive, and now everybody else wants to rectify what I say.
No, not at all. I agree with you. I was trying to also, because you used the word bleak, and obviously these are challenges. To give a little bit of also some positive signs into the room. The previous report was published in 2014, and that was before Paris. At the time, we thought that transport was one of the most difficult sectors to decarbonize, and we were thinking of biofuels as being a logical role here. By now, I think in many countries, we see a very clear road to electric transport. The renewables at the time in 2014, we would have written renewables are attractive, they are more expensive than fossil fuels, but you can use them. By now, in 2022, in most places of the world, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels. And companies are making commercial decisions to invest in renewables. And on the Paris Agreement is formally a quite weak agreement. It simply asks countries to submit their NDCs. At the same time, you see countries responding to it. Last year, almost all the countries, at least 100 countries in the world, have formulated net zero targets. They're not completely implementing them yet, but they have formulated them. Companies are referring to Paris. And so the highest emission scenarios of IPCC that we published in 2012 are now become really unlikely. They're not relevant anymore. And so we're slowly making a change. It's slow. It's not the way that we should be doing it. We want to do this cost optimally. But there are also positive signs.
Thank you, Detlef, for some for these words of optimism at the very end. I have a very short round off in terms of content, and I have 2 announcements, and then I'll let you all go. First, what I noticed being up here as a moderator in between the conversation with you and our speakers here is that a lot of you are asking questions of value, right? Political questions. How is it that we should act? How should the IPCC change? And for better or worse, we have created a system in which we separate those questions, those political questions, from the scientific questions. And we have a scientific panel here that tells you the science. But that doesn't mean that all of those political questions aren't deeply important. And I would ask all of you to just not let us get away with that, right? Keep asking those questions. All those questions that you ask them of all your lecturers, all the time, right? Don't ask them necessarily to the people who work here and who spent their life working on this and probably, I don't know, still haven't answered my question, feel frustrated by being hemmed in at times by what they can say. And so ask the people that annoy you, that don't do what they should be doing. Hold us to account. Hold the university to account. And I really liked it. That was my 2 cents. Then 2 practical things. One is this was all recorded. So if you want to share this with someone, if you want to use it in your lectures, if you're a teacher, feel free to. Finally, we have drinks outside, just over there. So if you want to ambush our speakers, I hope that they will still be there. You can do that. Thank you all for being here.